Hi, I am Madeline James, and I have something that I think will be pretty interesting to talk about today. If you've been following along, right now I'm working on my magic systems, but I'm going to be moving into a bit more in depth of my society building here soon. And something that I have also been doing lately is a lot of research into early state building, antiquity, early history, and, state building in general for my cultural world building guide series. The antiquity and state building part of the guide just came out. So if you've looked at that, I have learned a lot of things, and it has triggered a lot of thoughts about the basis of society and how magic might play into that. So today we're going to kind of talk through the process I've been going through to kind of work through how my magic system is going to affect the fundamental society ideas on my planet and what the differences in the different types of states and, other smaller groups, non-states that I might see as well. If you haven't watched that cultural world building guide part, you'll probably be able to follow along this just fine, but I'm not going to re-explain everything. So if you want to understand what I'm talking about, I would just go watch that video or scroll through the blog post or something. I'll link the video down below, but let me get all my notes out, and yes, let's get talking. Okay, so this is a lot of notes, but bear with me. So just as sort of a basic foundation, I sort of have two realms, a human realm and a magic realm. And in the human realm, you have people, animals, plants, etc. And in the magic realm, you have spirits, which can essentially sort of control the elements as they pertain to wind, and which is essentially kind of weather, right? You can think about it as weather. And then above them all, you have two goddesses, a goddess of sort of society and of nature. That's a big oversimplification, but that's sort of the idea. So first, I wanted to consider when magic would become relevant to human society, or how it would become relevant sort of in stages. So this could be either like the introduction of magic to your people, or when they had the ability to access it. And this will tell you when history would have diverged, essentially. So I decided that it would make sense that the first implications would sort of appear around the same time as like your first like larger rank societies and early states. And that's essentially when the society and the nature goddess would begin to care what humanity does, right? Because it would be starting to affect that balance between society versus nature, order versus, balance, and all that sort of thing. I'm assuming they would have been, very interconnected with first societies and early history, definitely tying into the mythos and creation story of a lot of these societies and a lot of these people. And then this would kind of continue on into part two, which is what was the impact of this on society, which I'm sort of just calling my like early antiquity period, but this part doesn't necessarily matter. But in this period, I essentially think the goddesses could have influenced spirits to improve or worsen farming or subsistence gathering. Bands that worshipped or revered spirits or nature goddess may have seen encouragement of growth of smaller settlements with like really easy subsistence options. So which would have essentially like held them back from growing too far, right? Because then it would have been breaking the balance, aka what you would see with like larger complex societies. But on the other hand, worshipping of the spirits or society goddess may have allowed better farming conditions, which would allow for easier state building, which obviously would have had a pretty big but very different impact, which really, it sort of makes sense, right? This is a society versus nature thing, and, it makes sense, right, that that's a thing. So then I sort of thought, well, what kind of societies might have developed as sort of basic formulas that I could expand on? And I sort of came up with four initial options. Option one being worship or offerings to a society goddess, so people that worship the society goddess in exchange for them to help with agriculture and help with the growth of the civilization, right? So you would have seen really strong agriculture. You would have seen probably the earliest and largest state building with a lot of stratification and inequality. You would have seen the religion and the church being very powerful, likely fueling the leadership and power hierarchy. So they probably would have been our elites. You would have had maybe it be more open borders, more open to expansion and migration, as it is a goddess of society and connection that they are worshiping. So I could kind of see there being large states and empires fairly early on with this, lots of stratification, right? And then the second kind of formula I'm seeing is those that are learning to control the spirits. So this is part of my magic system that I'm not really going to get into, but essentially there's a way to control the spirits without needing to basically revere or worship them to get them to do what you want, and also not requiring you to, revere or worship a goddess to get them to make the spirits do what you want. So I think you would have seen something similar, right? Stronger agriculture, some stronger stratification and inequality, probably not as strong as on this side, but it would have still been decently strong. They wouldn't have had that same push towards more complex societal structures, like here if they're worshiping a society goddess. And also I think these societies would have in general been smaller and more isolated, partially because having the ability to control the spirits would have been what would have given them a leg up, would have given them an advantage. And I think that would have been a very guarded secret in most of these societies. So maybe we would have seen like more city-state sized groups here, right? Where all the secrets and everything could be contained and closely watched in a small area. And I think power would have originated from that knowledge or, ability to control magic. So that's who we'd see in our elites, and, maybe smaller city-states, still some amount of stratification, but not as extreme as over here. And then option 3, I have where they worship the nature goddess or just spirits, specifically in the way for, benefiting, more natural balanced purposes. I think you would have seen less stratification and inequality in general, as balance and equality would have been a lot more favored just due to, what the nature goddess represents. And so I'm thinking you would have mostly seen these as subsistence groups or non-state groups in general, probably nothing more stratified than, early feudalism, I would guess. It would be very decentralized. They would be more spiritual and superstitious, maybe more egalitarian, and I think they would have revered wisdom and experience over anything else. So their, elders would have been, would have had less formal power, but they would have been based off, who was the wisest, who understood, what the nature goddess or spirits wanted, right? So maybe a little bit of people in a more spiritual role, but it wouldn't necessarily be like an organized church or something, right? It would have been individuals. Low stratification, if any stratification, and smaller non-state groups. And then the fourth category I have here would also kind of encompass a lot of different options, but essentially people that reject the goddesses or spirits. And this is not to say that they reject religion and spirituality as a whole, right? But it's saying that the goddesses and spirits that specifically, are in charge of what we've already talked about, right? They would have not lent into any actual magic affecting their development, right? So they would have had to lean into technology instead of getting help from the spirits or goddesses and magic in general, which meant in order to be competitive, right, they would have had to be working a lot harder. Things would have been a lot more difficult. They would have had to really prioritize achievement and been a lot more competitive. So I think maybe we would have seen this kind of formula being a little bit more authoritarian, a little bit more coercive. Probably they would have arisen later than other states. So maybe at the top it would have been innovations or engineers, or whoever would have been at the top of whatever ideology that they would have based this on, whatever like anti-magic thing. Maybe there's like, I don't know, another goddess or a being or creation or something, some entity that represents the opposite of magic, something like that, right? Would have been where our elites would come from. We would have seen high coercion and inequality. So at the bottom, these bottom tiers would have been very unfree. Maybe it would have had a lot of slavery. Maybe it would have just had a lot of like corvée labor or debt servitude or something. And I think these would have been later states or empires. I could see these definitely leaning more into a lot of imperialism and colonialism for the purpose of like not necessarily just expanding the home nation and expanding like who is considered part of the core entity like we probably would have seen here. I think over here maybe we would have seen a lot more of you know, taking advantage of the resources and work and trade networks and everything of other societies versus welcoming them into their society, right? And these are all, again, just like really rough formulas just to kind of give me an idea of the options and to kind of really think through how the effects of magic and the way they see it and the way they interact with the magic system would have or could have affected different societies. All right, so then the next step is considering other implications through history. And I think this really will depend on your world, and you probably already have a lot of ideas, but 3 of the things that came to my mind were first, regions and borders. And this is just due to the nature of the magic system, but particularly those societies that were, you know, really dependent on the spirits, they would have probably had their borders and regions more defined by the territory of those spirits that they worship and control. And then for stability and instability, you know, states in general were already very unstable, but I think that there could have been a lot of quick climate change and wind change directions and all of that could have been very severe and sudden, even more so than in our history. And that could have been due to the favor or punishment of the winds and spirits, which thus could have led to those different types of societies whose success is based off the favor of, you know, the goddesses may have seen them as more punishing goddesses, right? Where, you know, if anything goes bad, it means the people, you know, messed up. There would have been a lot of differences there in the culture over a, you know, loving, accepting goddess that wants to protect them versus one who is punishing and is constantly looking for mistakes and faults, right? Like that would have had a very large societal and cultural impact. And then just thinking about the origin myths and beliefs, which we'll sort of get into in this next one too, but essentially I think that there could have been differences in the exact origin myths for the goddesses or spirits, and humanity's relation to them, right? And then the sort of different understanding of rituals that could be used to influence them, right? That spiritual knowledge, and then some degree of different interpretations of what these spirits actually want specifically, right? And to a lesser extent, the goddesses as well. And then 5 is basically tying into that last one where we're brainstorming the early myths, sagas, and origin stories. This isn't necessarily what actually happened, right? This is what people believe, right? And then tying into that, that gives us the base of different religions and different ideologies, which would then give us the different sorts of power structures and societal structures that we would see. And those are kind of the main things here that I've gone through at this level. Okay, so that is kind of everything. There's a lot more in depth I kind of need to go onto the little specifics, but I think this was kind of everything at a high enough level that you might be able to think pretty easily about how it applies, you know, to your world and your histories and magic systems, and then, you know, branch off from there. But I enjoyed having you along. If you want to like, comment, subscribe, that'd be great. I also recently set up a Ko-fi as a sort of experiment, so if you want to check that out, that's down in the description below. And I will see you in the next one.